Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for today's lesson on AP Government Unit 2, where we are going to review the most crucial unit for your AP exam. This unit covers our 3, sometimes 4 with bureaucracy, branches of government, and makes up a huge part of your exam. In fact, this unit alone counts for up to 25 to 36% of the points you will need to pass your AP exam. And if you consider the score that you will need to pass the test, mastering this unit will put you well on your way to earning that free college credit. Once again, this is a review lesson which assumes you've already covered the material with your teacher, and I have more in-depth lectures of each unit if you want to check those out. As I mentioned, a large portion of the exam will test your knowledge of the responsibilities and the powers or checks of each branch, and you should always try to be thinking in the back of your mind throughout your review, what does the Constitution say, if anything, about the responsibilities and rules the branches have, especially in regards to each other. With that in mind, let's start out with a little quiz. Which foundational document is about checks and balances? If you said Fed 51, you would be correct. This is a doc that often works well in the thesis-based FRQ, which we'll talk about later. And this unit is all about Fed 51, as checks and balances are a huge part of the 3 branches. Many of your questions will relate to a policy of one branch or department of the government, and how another can stop or check that branch from abusing their power. So let's start by looking at Congress, the legislative or lawmaking body, which represents the constitutional concept of republicanism with a small r. Now remember, when you see or hear the phrase original intent, you want to think about what the framers of the Constitution meant at the time of its drafting. And with a large amount of powers and responsibilities given to the Congress beyond just making laws, the framers obviously intended it to be the most powerful branch. But we'll look at how that dynamic has changed. Remember, at the Constitutional Convention, the framers decided to create a bicameral or 2-house legislature, which in Fed 51, Madison again describes would provide another check on the legislative process. It also gave us a Senate with equal representation and the House of Reps based on population. Here's an overview of the differences between the 2 houses, and I've bolded the ones that are most important if you want to hit pause and write them down. We're going to move on to the models of representation. Quickly, delegate is basically just doing what your constituents want. Trustee, my kids say trustee, trust me. Representatives use their own judgment and opinions. And politico, very often they are balancing out those needs of the constituents versus those of the party. So let's look at the unique properties of the House of Reps first, sometimes called the People's House, as it was the only original elected federal body when the Constitution was written. You might think of the participatory model of democracy with the framers' original intent for the House. Another aspect you need to consider is the sheer size, again, currently 435 voting members, and how that impacts debate, as there's much stricter rules for the amount of time allotted to debate and for discussion, and this is set by the House Rules Committee, which is controlled by the party that has the majority of seats in the House. A mini political check on the House's agenda and operations, as they control which bills will be voted on, and therefore have major influence over the House. Powers and responsibilities unique to the House of Reps are that all revenue or tax bills must originate in that House. Part of Congress's power of the purse concept. And here we have the House Ways and Means Committee that addresses changes to federal taxes, although the Senate will have to approve them. The House also initiates impeachment proceedings. However, even if the House impeaches a president, as we've seen in recent history, or any high-ranking official, they have a trial in the Senate, and we've talked about how difficult it is to find one guilty by a 2/3 majority of the senators. Because House members only serve a 2-year term, they're always running for re-election, and they are also impacted by gerrymandered districts, which can lead House members to be more partisan. The length of their term and the need to keep their constituents happy means that House members are more likely to follow the delegate model of representation. House districts are impacted by two of our must-know SCOTUS cases about apportionment and redistricting. In Baker v. Carr, a 14th Amendment equal protection case, which you may remember as the one person, one vote precedent, ensured that districts have equal number of constituents as other districts. In Shaw v. Reno, the Supreme Court ruled that attempts by the state of North Carolina to create an additional majority African American congressional district was unconstitutional, setting the precedent that no congressional districts could be drawn based on race of their constituent. Next up is the Senate with its 100 members, allowing for less formal rules about debate as demonstrated by the filibuster. It originally was made up of members chosen by state legislatures rather than the people, lending to an early elitist model of democracy. Of course, that changed with the 17th Amendment in 1913. And finally, with their 6-year terms, senators have more freedom to utilize the trustee model of representation. The most unique power that the Senate has that the House doesn't is their advice and consent role, where they confirm presidential appointments and treaties. Of course, both houses do have shared powers, such as the power to declare war, and laws must pass through both houses of Congress, and both have to agree on a final federal budget. So they do have to cooperate. Now, in the budget process, you have some vocabulary you need to know. Entitlement programs are those that the federal government needs to pay, such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which make up a whopping 2/3 of the annual budget. That leaves discretionary spending, where the government has a choice about how much to spend. The vast majority of the discretionary budget goes to our military, leaving little left over for other federal programs, and it's the reason we usually have a deficit, the extra money spent beyond what is collected in taxes and other forms of revenue. I'm sure you learned about how Congress is structured into committees, most important being the standing or permanent committees doing most of the work. And finally, we see why it's so important for a party to gain control of one or both houses of Congress. Whoever controls the majority of the seats chooses committee chairs, who have major influence over proposed bills in those committees, as well as other leadership roles, such as choosing the Speaker of the House, again controlling the agenda. Okay, since we're spending a crazy amount of time in Congress, I'm going to skip through some other vocab that hopefully you covered again. Feel free to hit pause. They are log rolling or trading votes, pork barrel spending, bringing that bacon home to your district, and constituent services. Here again, that power of the purse concept, you can see where Congress gets their monetary powers in the Constitution, Article 1. Now, normally you talk about taxing, but that second one, appropriations, is important. Congress controls the appropriations or budget for executive agencies, and this serves as a check on the bureaucracy and could lead to clashes with the presidential agenda. So as we transition to the president, remember the concept of divided government where one party controls the White House and the other Congress. This often leads to political gridlock, holding up appointments, policy, and legislation, which has been a major problem as of late with our federal government. So, what Federalist paper argued for a strong unitary executive? If you said Fed 70, you would be right. Hopefully you know the job of the president is to enforce or execute the law. And Fed 70, written by Alexander Hamilton, argued that we would need one individual who could make quick decisions for things such as national defense. In addition to the ability to make quick decisions, having one unitary president would make it easier to place blame for executive decisions. Now, we talked about the rise of the modern powerful president. And you want to associate that with the use of what are known as informal powers, those not outlined in the Constitution, but inherited over time. Ever since FDR and his New Deal legislation, presidents have played a much bigger role in initiating policies or legislation through their use of the bully pulpit. Okay, so to look at those informal powers, let's see if you can list 5 formal powers in the Constitution. If you said veto, commander-in-chief of the military, giving the State of the Union address to Congress, appointing justices of the Supreme Court, and there are more, but you would be right. In addition to the ones we mentioned, the president has the power to pardon individuals convicted of crimes, appoint ambassadors, negotiate treaties, but notice that those last three must be confirmed by the Senate. Okay, so let's see if you remember the big informal powers we discussed. They are executive orders, executive agreements, signing statements, and the bully pulpit. And this falls into what College Board wants you to think about in their benchmark, where they have, quote unquote, competition and cooperation between the executive and legislative branch. Executive orders carry the weight of law but bypass Congress in the legislative policy-making process. And executive agreements are just treaties that bypass the approval of the Senate. Signing statements have risen in recent decades. You don't see this that much on your test. And these accompany a bill that a president signs, but signals that certain parts of the bill the president might not execute to the full extent that Congress had intended. And with the rise of modern media, presidents can have a lot of influence over Congress by going directly to the people to put pressure on them for policies they'd like to see them address in what, again, is called the bully pulpit. Now, the veto is not commonly used by the president, but it is a huge check on Congress, as it's extremely difficult to override. Now, let's take a closer look at that appointment power. And we have seen in recent divisive decisions in the news this summer the power of appointing Supreme Court justices who serve lifetime tenure. This gives the president the power to shape the decisions of the court long after their terms are over. Okay, I'm going to gloss over the cabinet. You might want to think of potential divided loyalty and presidential advisors, as well as the VP. But again, we're going to move on beyond this. Feel free to pause if you need to. Now, don't overlook the bureaucracy. Bureaucratic agencies really showcase this idea of cooperation and competition between Congress and the president, as both have influence over our massive federal government. One of my students complained to me last year that the test was all about the bureaucracy, which I'm sure wasn't true, but he obviously slept through the section as we covered it in class. The bureaucracy's job is to implement policies and laws passed by Congress, but the agency and department heads are appointed by the president. If you remember the phrase bureaucratic discretion, where civil servants have some power in deciding how aggressively they are going to implement laws or executive orders. You also want to remember independent regulatory agencies with their quasi-legislative, executive, and judicial powers. In other words, they make regulations, which are like mini laws, enforce those regulations, and punish those who violate. Okay, so we already covered one of the checks that Congress has over the bureaucracy with their appropriations, but they also have oversight power and can hold hearings into bureaucratic agencies' implementation or regulations, especially if they disagree with them. The Senate also confirms department heads, and Congress can create or get rid of bureaucratic departments and agencies. Now, the president has influence, like we said, by appointing those heads of the departments in many agencies, and is going to pick ones that agree with them on their policies and ideas. The president can also issue an executive order, which the bureaucracy has to implement. Now, we're going to take a closer look at iron triangles and issue networks when we cover interest groups, as they make up 1/3 of this relationship. But for now, remember how Congress often delegates authority to the bureaucratic agencies, but does have the ability to rein them in the appropriations process. Okay, brain check for our last branch. Could be a clue. Which Federalist essay claimed the judicial branch would be the weakest? Yes, Fed 78. The Constitution was pretty vague about the judicial branch. It did create a Supreme Court without really giving them much power. It established lifetime tenure, and it said that Congress could create inferior courts, which they almost immediately did. And this is why Marbury versus Madison is so important, because it established judicial review, the power of the court to strike down laws as unconstitutional, providing this branch with their major check over the other two. In Fed 78, Alexander Hamilton did discuss the importance of judicial review, even though it wasn't in the Constitution, and he argued that the court was the least dangerous because they lacked the power of the sword, executive, and the power of the purse, Congress. He also discussed the importance of lifetime tenure, as this would provide the court with political insulation from the other branches and the people, because they would not have to run for elections. Now, we discussed the two theories about the role of judges. Judicial activists is one in which they view their role as arbiters of the Constitution, frequently using judicial review to impact policy and overturn laws. And the opposite philosophy, judicial restraint, which proposes that judges should leave policy making to elected branches. Judicial restraint has that Latin phrase stare decisis, or let the decision stand, associated with it, that judges should rely on precedent or previous court rulings to guide their current decisions. Hopefully you learned about the Warren Court, the most liberal judicial activist court, with famous rulings like Brown versus Board of Ed, Miranda versus Arizona, and more. But conservative courts can be viewed as activists too, as we saw this summer with the court overturning the precedent of Roe v. Wade and striking it down with judicial review. Finally, what checks do other branches have in addition to appointment and confirmation power over the judicial branch? Well, Congress can rewrite laws that have been struck down, just taking out those parts that were found unconstitutional. And we have seen presidents refuse to enforce certain SCOTUS decisions, but this is very rare. Well, that was a marathon, but the branches of government, like I said, are the most important part of your exam. So for those of you who are still with me, I want to thank you guys for sticking around. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of resources are available at Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy on Teachers Pay Teachers by clicking the link below this video. And once again, guys, I want to thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon.